So you want some tips for GCSE English Language Paper 2. As your exam is approaching, you might be watching this on the day of your exam or maybe the day before. I'm going to tell you the things you should be doing, and I'll even give you some resources that will help you out in making sure you understand all the different question types within this paper, and just generally as a whole know how to manage your time and be able to work through the paper in an efficient manner so you end up getting as many marks as you can. So let's just get straight on with it. So I want to begin with talking about the section B of this paper. So by the way, I did AQA for English language, but if you did any other examples, the tips in this video should be able to help as well. So in terms of section B, when you go into your exam, you're going to be either asked to write a letter, an article, a leaflet, or a speech or an essay. So the first thing I want to make clear for you guys is know what the difference is between these different texts, because the way you're going to write something, if it's an essay compared to if it's a speech, for example, is going to be slightly different, and you should be able to know what things would make more sense in an essay and what things would make more sense in a speech, for example. A speech is a very common one that they usually like to ask about. So let's say we are writing a speech and it's like a persuasive speech. You have to really use those persuasive techniques. So if you're trying to put forward an argument, you really want to try and provoke something out of the person who's reading it and really make them believe what you're saying and agree with you. So you have to use all those different techniques. So we're not talking about similes, metaphors anymore. We're going to be talking about tripling, rhetorical questions, maybe adding in anecdotes as well, so like stories that can help make your argument even more robust. They don't have to be true. Another thing I want to also mention is it's actually quite useful to put statistics in this as well. So for example, if you are trying to argue for something, you can put like, in fact, 1 in 10 people or something like that, right? It doesn't have to be true, but as long as it makes sense and it backs what you're saying, it's another way that makes you sound more convincing and makes you sound like you know what you're saying. And I think the most important thing you need to do within the speech or article or whatever it is that you're writing, you want it to be as engaging as possible. You want it to be interesting. That's what's going to sell it to the person who's reading it, or if it's a speech, what they'd be listening to. Let's say if you are giving a speech, you want it to sound engaging so people can listen to it and therefore be persuaded by it. That is the very most important thing that you need to do with this. And in terms of specific advice in how to structure your question 5, to structure the way you write the different essays, what you talk about in which paragraph, the conclusion, how that works, because the conclusion is very important as well. I would recommend for you to not only watch videos of people walking through different structures and things, so you know the English YouTubers, all of them, watch as many of those videos as you can and really understand the different ways you can write this question and pick a structure that works for you and stick with that structure. But another thing that's really important is to read other people's texts as well. So if you find any full mark or like really high mark, even if you're only aiming for a pass, try and look for those really good essays and try and see what they've done. See what kind of things they put in those essays that made them get the top marks, and try and get inspiration from it. See the way they use different words, see the way they use different persuasive techniques, see the way they've put in emotive language, for example, things like that, and then try and apply that into your own essay. I don't want you to be writing essays right now as revision. That's not going to be useful. Instead, if you have the time, I want you to go through past papers, look at what the question was, and just try and make a plan of what you would write if that came up. And then if you've run out of things to write about, that's when you watch a YouTube video of someone going through that exact question, because there's tons of YouTube videos of people giving full-on walkthroughs for every one of these questions, and see what kind of things they mentioned. See if there's anything you missed out. See if there's something they've mentioned that you mentioned as well, but they've mentioned in a slightly different way. Okay, so that's what I want to say about the section B of the paper. I personally started with the section B first, and then I moved on to the rest of the paper, but it's completely up to you in the way you want to do it. That's just the way it worked for me. At the end of the day, it's about how you manage that time. Make sure that if you are starting with section B or if you're starting with section A, know how much time belongs to that section, so that when that time is up, you move straight on with the next section, because you don't want to waste any more time. Even if you're still writing out the last paragraph or so of a question, if you've finished the time for that section, move on, because you're more likely, as I said before in my previous video, you're more likely to get more marks in the other section that you need to start than for you to finish up those couple lines, because that might give you like max a mark or so. So you really want to try and gather as many marks as you can here. Okay, so speaking of the other section of the paper, so in terms of AQA at least, you have 4 questions. First question is multiple choice, we don't need to worry about that. Second question is an 8-mark question where you're basically writing a summary comparing the 2 different texts, because remember in this paper you have 2 texts now instead of 1. Now all you need to do is have a set structure in how you're going to do this question, and if you have that structure in place, you're going to be fine, and it's the same for all the other questions as well. So within this question, because it's 8 marks, what I did was I wrote 2 paragraphs, 2 chunky paragraphs, so worth 4 marks each. You don't want to spend too much time on this because remember it's only 8 marks. So we're going to give ourselves about like 8 minutes or so to write this question out. Now what I did is I'd get a point, I'd look at the 2 different sources and I'd compare how the point that I mentioned related to the 2 different sources, and then what I try and do is I try and get a reason for that difference. I'm basically trying to read through the lines here to try and understand why there is a difference between the 2 texts. Why is it that one is like this, one is like that? And then I do that for a second time as well in the second paragraph, and that would usually get me all the 8 marks. Question 3 focuses on a single one of the 2 sources, and it asks you about both the language and structure within it. So it's a bit of a combination question from paper 1, and you're basically doing the same thing as before. Now, one thing I do want to just make clear as well, so this question usually says something along the lines of how does the writer use language and sentence structure to influence the reader. Obviously, when you're reading the text, you're probably not going to be influenced, okay? So when you're writing, don't say, therefore this influences the reader. That does not count as a proper link, okay? So you know how you have to link at the end of every paragraph, you link it back to the question. You just saying that interests the reader or that influences the reader doesn't say anything. That's just useless. You don't want to say something like that. You want to make a point and then you go back to that point that you're addressing. For example, the writer uses metaphors to show a sense of like whatever blank, so whatever it is, and then you can bring it back at the end. The things that you want to avoid saying is stuff like this influences the reader, this interests the reader, this impacts the reader. None of those mean anything, so you don't want to say them. Refrain from saying those because it's just the same thing as just not writing anything there at all, so just don't do it. Now section 4, 16 whole marks. So this is a very chunky question and you want to put about 20 minutes or so into this question. Obviously the main thing I want you to do for this is the comparison. Make sure it's very clear, the comparisons that you're making from each extract. And remember that in this question now you can talk about anything. So you can talk about language techniques, sentence structures, anything, whatever helps you put your point across, it works in this one. And in terms of, as I said, if you want specific structures and how to write these questions, I would recommend YouTubers such as Mr. Everything English, Mr. Sowles, Mr. Bruff. All of them have lots of good structures and high-level paragraphs that you can read through and understand what they've done and try and steal bits from, because after all, that's what you're doing in English. You're basically just writing stuff based on the inspiration from other texts that you've read. So the more high-level text and question answers that you read, you're more likely to be able to get some of those things and put them into your own writing. So overall, I just want to say, keep an eye on the time. That's the most important thing within this paper. Make sure that you tell yourself, I'm going to spend 15 minutes here or 8 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, and you actually spend that long. Don't waste time in this paper. Don't go overboard on your timing, because if you spend a little too long on one question, you're automatically taking off minutes from the next question. So make sure you're very strict with your time management here, and make sure that in the section B, you're engaging, you're interesting, you're persuasive. That's what I want to leave you guys with. So good luck for English language, and see you guys hopefully very soon.